and welcome back to my video. So now we are going to continue with our food delivery application. So now we are going to work on the product checkout, right? But before we work on the checkout depends on the address. So what we are going to do is we are simply going to work on retrieving the user address and editing the user address and also uploading the user address, right? So if you are looking for someone that can build a scalable mobile application for you or a business, please, you can just hire me on Upwork, or you can just use my email below. Okay, so without wasting much of the time, let's get started. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a features inside our features folder. We need to create a folder called address. So inside that folder, we are simply going to create another folder called model, and then we are simply going to create another one, which is going to be our repository. And then we also need a controllers folder. So let's create a controller folder. And the last one, let's create a screen folder. And then let's create a widget folder. Okay, so now that we are done with this, so we should start by creating the models folder, right? So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to go inside our auth folder right inside, and then we have the user folder right here. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to copy it, right? I'm simply going to copy the user model, and then I'll go back inside our controller and then our model folder, and then I'll simply create a file. I'm going to just name address model.dat. And then we're simply going to paste this file here. And then I'm simply going to change it to address model. So let's just replace everything with address. Okay, now we have address model. So now what I'm simply inside for our users address, what we need is we need the city. We also need the address itself. And then we also need the house number. And then we also need instructions, right? So these ones are required, so let's just change it to required. Let's just get rid of the exclamation mark, and then let's change our part files here to address. Okay, so now let's use that run to generate Okay, so we use this command here, run build runner build delete any conflicting outputs, right? So this is just going to generate our first models. So it's saying in package build run, I could not find bin runner. So let's check what's causing the issue. We have the build runner package. So let's first upgrade Flutter to major versions first. Okay, now let's run that build runner. Let's see. Unfortunately, it did not generate. Okay, so I made a typo. It's supposed to be address. Okay, I'm just going to rename this file. Make sure that the file name is the same as the one that you typed on the part file. Okay, so let's run the command again. Okay, unfortunately, somehow it's not okay. It's still a typo. It's supposed to be address. Okay, let me run it again. Okay, so you can see now we have generated first files right here. Okay, so the last thing that we need to do here, let's create that will just this line of code that will just retrieve a list of addresses, right? So it's going to be address model from JSON. And then we want it to be a dynamic string. And we just want it to return a list of the address model. Then we just check a string, then it will just map. And then we just map it to address model from JSON. And then we'll pass the E. Okay. All right, so now that we're done with our model, now we need to move on to our repository, right? To our address repository. So let's go inside our repository file. Let's create another file. Let's name it address repository. That. And then let's create a class. So in our address repository, what we need is we are going to be communicating with Firebase Firestore. So at first we need to initialize Firestore. And then the next thing that we need to do is we need to attach Firestore to our constructor. Let's create the constructor. And then required Firebase Firestore. And then we just attach it to our constructor, and then we need to import Cloud Firestore. So now that we have imported Cloud Firestore, now the first method that we need is the method for adding our address to our Firestore database, right? So we are going to use an either function, dynamic, and then it must return a future of type void, right? And then the address is going to take in our address model, and then at first we need a try catch block, right? We need a try catch block. So in our try catch block, what we are simply going to do is, if we are successful uploading our address to Cloud Firestore, we are simply going to return right, and then we are simply going to pass in Firebase constants. So we need to add, let's go to our constants. Inside our Firebase constants here, what we need to do is we need the address reference. So I'm simply going to copy this, and then I'm simply going to paste here. It's going to be our address reference. So this is going to just point out to our address collection inside our Cloud Firestore. So it's going to be address. So let's just get rid of the doc here. It's address reference. So Firebase constants, let's make sure that we import fp.dat and then we import Firebase constants. So let's import, let's check what's the name of our Firebase constants. Okay, it's small letter C. So let's import Firebase constants, and then we need the address reference. And then we are simply going to set it we are simply going to set it to the address, right? Address.toJSON, right? Okay, so let's import. It's supposed to be Firebase instance. Okay, it's saying it's not defined for address reference. So let's see what's going on. So we are simply going to edit, right? And then if there's an error, what we want to do is we just want to catch the exception, right? So we just want to catch the exception. The exception can be Firebase exception. The exception can be Firebase exception. In case it's a Firebase exception, what we want to do is we want to just display the exception, to throw the exception, and then if it's another exception, we simply want to return left the failure message, right? With the failure message, the message is going to be e.toString, right? So saying null to be returned by the return type either void sponge non-nullable. So let's see what's causing the error here. So what we need to do is, I forgot, with we need to set this. The document, we need to reference it to our user ID, user.id. So here we need to change it to set. And then, okay. Okay, it's because we forgot the return function. That's why it's throwing that error. So we need to just return left. Okay. So now we need to create a method for getting the user address. So to get the user address, we create a stream method. address model, since we just want to retrieve one address. So what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to return Firebase constants dot address reference dot snapshots. We want to get the snapshots. Then once we get the snapshot, what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to map those snapshots, right? We are simply going to map those snapshots. We're simply going to map those snapshots into an address model from JSON. Okay, so this is the method for getting our address from the Cloud Firestore. What I'm simply going to do is we are simply going to return the snapshots, right? Since there are snapshots inside our data, and then we are simply going to map each snapshot into our address model, right? And then we are going to map it as a string dynamic, right? And then the other method that we need is the method for updating our database, right? So this method is almost similar to method for adding data to a database. So I'll simply copy it and then we'll simply modify it, right? So, and then I'm going to change it to update address, right? So what we simply, the difference now is instead of set, simply change it to update, right? So this is the method for updating data inside our Cloud Firestore, updating our database, right? Now what we need to do is let's create a provider, which is address repository. Just go to address repository, which is equal to provider. The reference, then address repository. And then what we simply have to do is let's import Flutter Riverpod, right? Let's import Flutter Riverpod, and then our address repository needs a parameter which is Firestore, since we pass it to the constructor. So where do we get it? We get it from the Firebase Firestore provider, right? So we're simply injecting it. So let's see. Firebase Firestore provider. So if we go inside our constants, I think under core, if we go under core, providers, if we go under providers, we see this Firebase Firestore provider, right? So supposed to be Firebase. Firebase Firestore provider. So let's import it. Create one positional argument. Okay, so let's just go and then let's just grab the name here. let's come back inside our reference.watch. Let's paste it. Then let's try to import it. Okay, here we go. So now we are simply going to move into our address controller. So now let's create our address controller, because now we don't want our user interface to interact with the database directly. So we have to create a controller. So the controller, what the controller does is just that the user interface sends events to the controller, and then sends events to the controller, and then the controller sends those events to our repository. And then if there is any data from the server, our controller will then convert it into states, which will now trigger our UI change, right? So let's create address controller. So this address controller is going to extend the async notifier provider. Which is just going to return an async value, which is going to be of void. Then let's import Flutter Riverpod. Then to be double D. Okay. So as you can see here, we have a red squiggly line that says missing implementation of async notifier builder. So basically, when you're using an async notifier, you need a build function, right? So our build function is going to be async value type void, and then build. So basically what this build function, just think of it as just sort of like an init state. Whenever our address controller is initialized, the build function is the first one to run, right? So that's where you can like initialize dependencies, or if you want to trigger state changes whenever this address controller is initialized, right? So let's just create and let's just initialize our address repository. Then let's import the address repository, and then what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to initialize our address repository. It's going to be reference.watch. So what are we watching? We simply watch our address repository. We're simply going to watch our address repository provider, right? Let's watch our address repository provider, and then we are simply going to return our constant async value. We're going to return async value.data, and then the data is going to be none, since our async value is returning a type of void, right? Now let's create a method for adding our data to our database. So let's create a void, which is going to be add address. So what we are going to do is whenever this address is added to our database, we want to sort of like show a snake bar, notify the user that the address is added, or if there is an error, right? Then so what else do we need to add? We need the address itself. We need city. We also need the house number. And we also need the zip code, right? Need the zip code, and we also need the instructions, right? instructions. All right, so basically what we now have to do is let's import a material that for us to use the build context, right? So let's just create a response, which is go to address repository dot add address, right? So which is going to be our address module like this. Okay, so we have not created this address module. So to create, we simply say address model. We simply say our address model is equals to address module, and then with the address, city, house number, instructions, and then instructions can be null. And then also need a zip code. Also, I think we forgot the zip code inside our address. Yes, we forgot the zip code. So let's just create it. Required integer, then zip code. And then let's run that build runner to just regenerate these first files. Okay, so zip code, there's no need for us to convert it to a string. Let's just leave it like that. Right, so now that we are done, basically what we simply need to do now is we need to that's the good case about using the fp.package, package, right? We need to handle what goes on the right side and on the left side. Right, so on the left side, that's what we are going to use to represent when there is a failure. Right, so when there is a failure, we are simply going to display a message, right? Failure, simply going to display a message. It's going to be L.toString. Then on the right side, that means that it was uploaded successfully. So what we're simply going to do is we are simply going to return we are simply going to show a snake bar, right? So we just use scaffold messenger of context. And then we just want to show a snake bar. And then on the snake bar, what we will simply do is constant snake bar. Then the content is simply going to be text. And then the text is going to be address saved. Right, so let's import failure class. Okay, so now we are done with the method for getting our address. The next thing that we need to take care of now is the method for getting our address. So this one is simple and straightforward. It's going to be a stream this module get address. Then basically we are simply going to return our address repository. And then for the method to update the address, it's almost similar as method for creating the address. So what I'm basically going to do is I'm simply going to copy it. Then I'm going to change it to update address. And then instead of using add, I'm simply going to change it to update. And then we change it from address saved to address updated. All right. Now that we are done with our controller here. So this is our user controller address, which simply extends the AsyncNotifier, okay, which is a Riverpod class AsyncNotifier, and then we have this build function. This build function, whenever you use an AsyncNotifier, the build function is more of like an init method, right? It's the one that's initialized first, and then so once it's initialized, we want to initialize our address repository, right? And then we have this method for adding our address to our database, and then we have this method for getting our address, and then we have the method for updating our address, right? So now what we need to do is we need to create different providers. So the first provider that we are going to create is the address controller provider. So this address controller provider is simply going to use the AsyncNotifier provider. So this AsyncNotifier is of type address controller. Type address controller, and then async value of type void. Value of type void. Then what we are simply going to do is simply going to change the address controller.new. And then we need another provider for getting the user address. So right now, get address provider. Since we used a stream to get we're using a stream to get our address from Cloud Firestore, we simply use a stream provider. And then we will create the reference object, which is simply going to reference our Riverpod providers, right? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to first read the address provider, right, which is going to be reference.watch, and then it's going to be address controller provider.notify, right? Notify, right? So basically why we use this .notify function, this .notify function simply allows us to read items inside our address controller, right? This method inside our address controller. And then after that, what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to return address. As you can see, now we are able to just get address method. Okay, so now that we are done with our controller, now it is time to build the last section of our address, which is the user interface. Okay, so now we need to start working on our user interface. So we just go onto our screen, and then what I'm simply going to do is I'm just going to create an address screen file. Address screen file.dat. Okay, so this is just going to be a stateless widget. So it's going to be a stateless widget, and then going to be address screen. All right, so basically what we need to do, since we are going to consume Riverpod, we need to change this the stateless from stateless widget to consumer widget. And then inside our build function, we need to pass in the widget reference. Right, let's just pass in widget reference. Right, so now let's import Flutter Riverpod. All right, so now that we are done, so now basically what we need to do here is we simply need to get the address from our address controller, right? So basically what we will simply have to do, use the reference.watch, the watch method, and then what we're simply going to do is we're simply going to watch the get address provider. We're simply going to watch the get address provider. If we go inside our address controller here, you can see we have the get address provider. So that's the provider that we're simply going to watch. So basically what the watch method that does is just going to monitor if there are any changes. And then it will prompt our user interface to reload, right? So we have Flutter Riverpod, features, address controller. Let's get address provider. Okay, so let's import it. Okay, so just need to remove the parentheses. Okay. All right, so here what we're simply going to do is we are simply going to just return a scaffold widget. And then we need an app bar. And then let's simply just set in an icon theme in our app bar, icon theme for the back button. So it's simply going to be a theme of context, and then we provide our context. And then icon theme. And then let's also need to provide an elevation. So the elevation is going to be 0, and then we also need a background color. Okay, so both of these are supposed to be inside our, let's just cut, both of these are supposed to be inside our app bar, right? And then we need some actions. So just in case we need a button, right, to move on, let's say to our edit address page. So we'll use the actions, right? So for the actions, what we simply need to do is we simply need a text. And then the text is going to be edit address. And then let's style it. Okay, and then now for our scaffold widget, what we simply need is we need our body, right? We need to provide a body for our scaffold widget. So the nice thing about Riverpod is gives us like a when function, which allows us to take care of different instances depending on our state. For example, it allows us to end when we have our data, when there is an error, and when we are still loading our data from our database, right? So in this case, our database, our data is going to be an address. So let's just rename it to address. And then for now, we'll just leave it like this. And then for our error, we need an error. Then checks in an error is a parameter and also a stack trace. And then what we are simply going to do is we're simply going to return our error text that we created. Then just make sure that we convert this error to a string. And then for loading, we'll just display a circular progress indicator. Created our loader, so we are simply going to just display the loader, which is a circular progress indicator. So let's import it, right? Okay, so now we need to take care of the address, right? So basically what I'm simply going to do is let's create an address. An address model, which is equal to our address model, and then we'll simply pass in for the city, we'll simply pass in the city that we're getting from our database. Same as for the address. Same as the house number. Same as the instructions also. Then also the zip code. Okay, so now that we are done, so now let's import the address model from our model. Okay. So now what we're simply going to do, we're simply going to return address dot are going to check to make sure that if the address is not equal to null, so if the address is not equal to null, then we are simply going to show our safe area widget, and then we need a container widget, and then that container widget we need to decorate it. So okay, so what we simply need to do is we simply need to decorate our container. So and then which, yes, we need rounded corners, so we just use border radius. And then what you're simply going to do is we need to give our container a height of 300. And then now we need column widget. And then list of children. And then the first thing is we need a spacing from the top. So just use a size box widget. Okay, give it a height of 25. And then now we need a row widget. Inside this row widget, we need a text. So the first text is going to be address. Then also with a style. And font size. Size is 15. Okay. Let's just copy the same text and then let's paste it below. And then we'll simply change this to data.address. Address model.address, and then we need a spacing between these two text items. So we just say main axis alignment, then just use the main axis alignment to space between. Yeah. All right, so let's copy this, let's paste it below. Then let's change from address to city. And then city. And then okay, so we also need a spacing here. So I'll use the size box widget. A height, let's give it a height of 10. Okay. Let's copy and then let's paste it below again. Then let's just change to house number. and then let's copy the size box, let's paste it here, and then let's just copy the whole item, and then let's paste it below. Okay, and then we need to change to zip code. Okay, now we are done, and then okay, we expect if there is no address, what we're simply going to do is to display a text. Just say no address. And then we are simply going to style it. Then let's give font size 20. Okay, so it's saying int can be okay, so let's convert it to a string. Okay, now that we are done, so we can say address. If the address is not equal to now, okay. Okay, so now this we are done with our address. What we simply have to do is we need to go to our settings screen. Let's go back to our settings screen. And then on our address items widget, what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to wrap this widget with the gesture detector. And then we're simply going to change it so that when the user taps on our gesture detector, we need to launch the address screen. Right? So it's going to be navigator. Then we provide a material page out, and then builder text in context. And then it will simply return our address page. So it's the address screen, right? So basically what I'm simply going to do now is I'm simply going to hot reload our application, and then we're simply going to check if everything is working. Right, so let's go to our settings screen, then our address page. Okay, saying that type map string dynamic is not a subtype of map typecast. So I think what's going on is I think we might have made a typo in our address model. So let's go inside our address model. Then let's check what might be the issue. So simply going to open Firebase console. And then Firestore, going to check it, addresses, house number, city, address, instructions, city. So let's go to our address model here, right here, city, we have it. address is correct, zip code is correct, house number is also correct. So okay, I'll simply stop and then I'll try to relaunch it again. Let's see what might be the issue. Okay, so I think I found the error. Here we use this address instead of addresses. So if we check our Firebase collection here, it's addresses instead of addresses. So we're referencing to a collection that didn't exist. Okay, so now let's just make sure our app finishes running and then we can just test it out. Okay, so I finally figured out the bug. The bug is because inside our event.data, we need to have parentheses. So we forgot to put parentheses. That's why it was telling us that event that is not a type of map string dynamic in typecast. So now let's hot reload the application. Let's check if the address is now showing. So he's saying that null is not a subtype of map string dynamic in cast. Okay, so let's check. Let me check what's going on. Okay, so the problem was basically the collection model. I had made a typo. That's why it was not displaying. And as well as if we go inside our address repository also, let's go inside our address repository also, you can see that the event.data here, we had forgotten to add parentheses, so that's why it was not displaying the address. So now if I go, you can see, yeah, it's giving us an error. So if we put in now the parentheses, you can see that we can easily get the address now. Now we can easily get the address like this. Okay, so basically what I want, if we go to our address screen right here, let's go inside our container that we created, our container widget that we created, because you see that the address, city, and the house number are close to the edges. I don't want them to be close to the edges. So basically what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to just wrap the container with a padding widget, right? So we are simply going to add padding so that we have space. Yeah, now we can see now we have that space here now. All right, so basically let's do the same thing for our edit address. I don't want it to be close to this screen. So let's go inside our app bar and then actions and then text. So let's wrap the text with also with the padding widget. Yeah, now we can see now it's nicely spaced right here around here. All right, so now we need to work on the edit address screen, right? So now let's start working on the edit address screen, right? So, okay, before we work on the edit address screen, we need to work on the add address screen, right? So let's just, inside our screen, let's just create an add address screen. So basically, since we are going to be working with text form field, we just make sure that our widget is going to be a stateful widget. Right, so basically what we need now, the first thing that we need is a global key to check the state of our form. I'll just call it the form key. Then it's of type form state. Just going to check our form state. All right. And then we need to create a text editing controller for the city. Supposed to be text editing controller. Okay, we also need to do the same thing for the address. Then we also need to do the same thing for the house number. Then we also need to do the same thing for the zip code. And then let's create the dispose override function. So we want to dispose these controllers, right? Once. So something for the address, and then also the house number, and then also the zip code. Then now let's work on our scalable widget. Background color. So the background color we can also use the primary color, and then we can also do the same thing for other. Now for the body, just make sure it's a single child store view. Then we need the form, and then for the form, in order to check the state of our form, we'll simply It's the form key. Then we need a text form fields. Okay, so inside the column we need a list of widgets. Text form field. All right, and then simply press controller, passing the house number, and then we'll enable suggestions here. And then we also need to define the keyboard type. So it's going to be text input type. Street address. Then changed to take on change, which tracks, which is going to track in the value to check if a value has changed, right? The value. Then we are going to make sure that we are simply going to assign number.text to our value. And then what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to just decorate our text form field using input decoration. Then we are simply going to define a border. Then we'll simply define the outer border, which is outline input border. Then we'll give it a border radius. It's going to be border radius .circular. And then just make sure it's 10. And then we also need to define the hint text. Which is going to just be house number. It's going to just display a hint to the user. We need to style these hints, so we use the hint style. And we just make sure the color is going to be black. And then we also have to show the prefix icon. Then it's simply going to be icon, and then icons.house. And then we'll simply give it a color of black. Then let's just make sure that the size is 20. And then we need to just align our label with our hint. Just set it to true. And then after that, we need to validate the input that the user enters, right? So to do that, we are simply going to make sure that we check if the value So we are simply going to check if the value is empty. If it's empty, by the way, what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to return enter address. And then After this, if it's not, we're simply going to return null. Saying expected and identify what's going on here. Okay, so this text form field is just going to be the same for other text form field. So what I'm simply going to do here is just going to add some spacing. Then below, I'm simply going to add this, and then we change it to city. So let's change the controller to city. And then let's change also the value to city. And let's also change the city, and then we'll just change this to enter city. So let's just make sure everything is correct. Yes, everything is correct. So let's copy it again, and then let's just paste it below. Okay, now from city we need to change to address. So we entered address at the top. So we had house number at the top. Now we need address at the bottom. Address, and then we'll change also the hint to address. Then we'll change it to enter address. Okay, this is done. And then the next one is the zip code. So we're simply going to paste it below again. Then we change it from city to zip code. Okay, so now that everything is done, now we need a button. So also need spacing. The button. Then it's going to be text, and then we're simply going to button. We're simply going to address. And then I think we need to just style this elevated button. The style, and then elevated, say elevated button, dot style from, and then let's just get a color. Click on color, let's make sure it's black. Then let's style this text. Let's just make sure it's white. Then let's just give it a font size. Font weight. Let's go to font weight. W500. Okay. Then what we're simply going to do here is we're simply going to use the reference dot read. So I think we forgot to add Riverpod to change this from stateful widget to consumer stateful widget, because now we want to be able to consume Riverpod providers. So we changed the stateful widget to consumer stateful widget. And then we also do the same thing with consumer state. Then we just make sure that we import Flutter Riverpod, and then everything is set. And then inside our button, what we simply have to do is reference.read. Then we want to read the address controller provider .notifier, and then we want to dot head address. And then what we're simply going to do is simply going to pass in the address text, then ct.text, then house number text, and then also the zip code text. And then let's just convert it to a string. So it's supposed to be converted to integer. So let's use int.pass. And then zip code.text. Then for the instructions, I think for the instructions we can just leave them as empty. Okay, so this is the add address page, so that will allow us to add the address to our database. So this screen is, we are not going to display it initially. We will display it in the checkout. In case the user doesn't have an address, then they'll get the option to just add the address. And then now the last one that we are going to work on is the edit address, right? So we are just going to work on the edit address. So basically what I'm going to do with the edit address is basically similar to our add address widget, but we'll simply have to modify just a few things. So I'm simply going to copy, and then I'm going to create another file, edit address page.dat. I'm simply going to paste it, and then I'm simply going to change to edit. So it's going to be edit address page. Right, so let's import a few material that. What else do we need to up color? Okay, Then we also need address controller. Right, so now what we need to change is we need to create a boolean which is going to be initialized, which initially is going to be equal to false. And then inside our address, inside our body, we need to modify our body. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to get rid of everything inside our body. So I'm simply going to do this address So what I'm simply going to do is I need to initialize the address, and then we are simply going to watch the get address provider. Get address provider, right? So what I'm simply going to do is simply going to, and then simply going to take care of when we get the data from the database. We can get the data from the database. We just want to return these widgets that I had copied right there, and then now we need, and then if somehow we get an error, we just need to display that error as a text. Then somehow if we're still loading, what I'm going to do is just display a circular progress indicator. Then let's import this loader widget. Okay, so now that we are done inside our data, let's check inside our data. Let's go inside our data function, right? So what we want to do is, if it's not initialized, what we want to do is we want to set the city text to our the one that we're getting from the database, right? So and then we want to do the same thing for the address. We want to set it to the one that we are getting from our database. So it's supposed to be address.text. We want to do the same thing for our house number. Then we'll also do the same thing to the zip code. So basically what this will do, and then let's set it to string. Then after this, we want to set initialize to true. So basically what this will do is it would, instead of showing us an empty text editing form field with an empty text editing form field, what this will do is it will fill the text form field with the values from our database, and then from those values we can just edit them. So to take care of this, let's go back to our address screen, and then inside our address screen, if you still remember, let's go inside our actions. So inside our actions, we want to wrap our text widget with a gesture detector. And then we want to take care of when the user taps on the text. So when they do, we want to navigate to our edit text screen. So then user material address screen. So we forgot one thing inside our edit address screen. So finally, instead of add address, we want to change this to edit. I want to change to update address. Okay, as you can see. Now, basically, now that we are done, let's just go to reload our application. And then let's check if everything is working correctly. Let's go inside our address page and then edit address. You can see now we now have this text form field, but they are too close to the screen and I don't want that. So basically what I'm simply going to do is the first thing that I need to do is I need to go inside our app bar. Then first thing I need is a title, then text, then edit address, then simply going to style it. Black, and the font size, then font weight is going to be font weight is going to be 500. Okay, so now it's just okay. We now have this edit address, and then I want space. So I'm going to use size box. Give it a height of like 20 there, and then the other thing is this form I want to add a padding widget because I don't want this text form field to be close to the walls here. Now you can see. Now let's try to update. Let's just delete and then okay, let's also edit the button text. So I'm going to change it from add address to edit. Okay, and then address updated. You can see even in our database here, it is already updated. And then we can even delete the 78, let's just say 100, and then edit address. You can see we now have it is updated. Okay, so basically that's it with the address. So in the next episode, let's start working on our checkout.